Welcome to Modus Cafe. Join us for fun, lighthearted, and educational conversations around training, athletic longevity, and the human side of climbing. With your hosts, Mercedes Pollmeyer and Katja Dev. Okay, so in today's podcast, we're going to cover the misconception that outdoor climbing is harder than indoor climbing. Really, we know that there is a difference. There's a difference between indoors and outdoors, but I think from my experience, my personal experience, and from experience of our clients, it can come down to experience. Like if you're starting out indoors, then indoors, your reference point is indoors, and maybe even specifically that gym that you're climbing at. Or if you're primarily an outdoor climber, maybe you have that option to start outside climbing and not really spend that much time indoors. Your reference point is that outdoor area. And so any other area or terrain that you're going to be on is going to feel so different, and it might feel more difficult compared to, what you're used to. So we're going to talk about this because we do believe that, any terrain, even gym, you just have to learn the specific skills. And I know Katja has a really great analogy for this.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, thank you. Hi. Yeah, the way I like to think about it, again, Mercedes just mentioned this. I just had a conversation with someone about this, that there's this idea that outdoor climbing is always going to be harder than indoor climbing. And objectively, Mercedes and I don't believe that is true. Now, subjectively, this might be true for you if you are used to climbing inside and not outside. And the analogy that I like to use for that is like learning a language. Let's say you are learning Spanish, that's your second language. And learning Spanish is like you going to the gym and climbing inside. And you spend a couple of years learning Spanish at school, and you get really proficient at it. And you feel like, oh, I got this down. I'm fluent at Spanish. But then you might travel to a different country that might have a pretty strong dialect, like Costa Rica, for example, has, if people speak Spanish in Costa Rica, but they have a pretty strong dialect. So you might get there and you might realize, whoa, I do have these Spanish skills, but now things are different. The context is different, and I'm in an area that I'm not used to speaking Spanish. And climbing outside versus inside is a little bit similar in that, yes, we are learning skills and technique when we climb inside, but outside climbing is like a different dialect when it comes to climbing as compared to climbing inside. And now the difference being that if you started climbing outside, you might find the dialect of climbing inside a lot harder. We actually, Mercedes and I, we know lots of people who climb harder outside than they do inside. In fact, I want to say, for those of you who know a little bit about climbing on granite, granite tends to be quite hard for people. Granite climbing is not an easy type of climbing, but including Mercedes, I know lots of other people who actually do climb harder grades outside on granite than they can inside. And today we want to talk about why that might be and the approach that we can take when we learn about climbing.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm definitely one of those people. I can climb so much harder outside than indoor. Part of that might be mindset.
Yeah,
And I
actually, why
do,
don't you share
yeah,
your experience? Like, why do you think you
yeah,
climb harder outside and inside? And then I'll
yeah.
share some of my
You know,
thoughts too.
I, I, s- I did start, like, I started climbing in a gym, but I spent most of my time outside climbing. Like, the people that I was fortunate to like be around, they always wanted to be outside. And so I was out there all day, sometimes like 2 to 3 days a week. And I felt like I just learned a lot more about climbing when I was outside. And in terms of like the intention that we bring to indoor climbing that I was bringing, and maybe like my crew, um, there wasn't as much like, okay, we have to like make indoor climbing something that we have to be really good at. It's more of a tool to get better at the outdoor climbing. So that was always my context. Like, okay, indoor stuff is always preparation for the things that we want to do outside. And I still kind of use that still today. Like I'm
Yeah.
not as interested in projecting indoors. I know that we've talked about performance and how you don't always have to be performing. And so like I really Like I use that a lot. Like if I'm in a gym, I'm like, yeah, I'm here to get the work done.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, I don't spend a lot of time projecting. But I think if I did, so one thing that I learned from, so I spent a lot of time climbing in Colorado, and then I moved to the Pacific Northwest. There is a lot of granite in Colorado, but it's just so different. Um, Moving to the Pacific Northwest, you've got Squamish, you've got Leavenworth, where it's also granite, but man, there's not a lot of footholds. There, like the terrain is very different. And that was a really big hit to my ego. I had a really hard time feeling like I was a good climber in the Pacific Northwest. And it took me a couple of years to really understand this new style of climbing. Um, and I do wonder if because there was a big battle inside of me, like, oh, I suck as a climber. Like, what was I doing this whole time in Colorado? Like, uh, and maybe I like poo-pooed the areas like Leavenworth sucks.
Oh, it's so
And
fun. You love it
yeah,
now. You love
I
it so much.
do. I do. I love Leavenworth. Yeah, and I do think some of that, I think I would have overcome some of those like physical barriers had I changed my mental barriers, a little sooner.
Ah,
Like, oh, like Leavenworth has something to teach me. What is this
yeah.
thing that it's trying to teach me? Oh, right, better footwork. Like you're gonna have to actually use technique in order to climb these compared to in Colorado, where I was just strong. Like I did not have very good technique as a climber in Colorado. So yeah, like I think that even just relative to where you are so used to climbing, every other area is going to feel hard. And try not to get in the way of yourself, when you go to these other areas. Like every new
Yeah.
area is probably going to feel hard,
Yeah.
you know.
So I love
Yeah.
that. Okay, can I just dissect what you said? Because there's so
Yeah.
many good things in there. One of the big things I want to say is, the mindset and intention is because I know this podcast today is about outdoor versus indoor climbing, but honestly, outdoor and indoor climbing, they're kind of like do two very different dialects, so to speak, to go with the analogy. But honestly, even just like going from one outdoor area to another outdoor area is quite different too. And even just going from one gym to the next. Do you know how often this happens that people, they climb at their home gym and then they go travel and they're like, oh my gosh, it's so hard here. And I will tell you, chances are good. You're just not used to that style. You're not used to those holds. And it's really important. In fact, when I write travel plans for my one-on-one athletes, and they travel, I usually encourage them to just like spend as much time as possible climbing at the local gyms because the different types of holds and movement will teach them so much. And I think that's really important. That's really important to keep in mind. And another thing that you actually talked about is just time spent. And I think that's a huge difference between outdoor and indoor climbing. For people who find outdoor climbing harder, it's simply, I don't want to say simply because it might not be true, but I'm saying often that can be because they spend more time inside than outside. And the people who we know climb better outside than inside, they in fact actually they spend more time climbing outside than climbing inside. And so if you're someone who climbs a lot inside, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Unlike Mercedes, I love projecting inside. And so there's different people have different passions. I climb inside differently than other people, let's say like Mercedes. And that's totally okay. I don't think there's anything wrong with climbing inside. And I say this because sometimes there can be a bit of a divide in terms of climbing outside is the real climbing and climbing inside is not real. And I disagree with that. I really enjoy climbing inside. In fact, right now, for personal reasons, I'm choosing to just climb inside. I'm not climbing outside right now. And it feels really good to me, and I'm having a lot of fun with that. I know a lot of really strong people. Hey, all the World Cup athletes mostly climb inside too, and they're having a good time with it too. So there's nothing wrong with it. But just if you spend a lot of time climbing inside, you're really getting to know all the holes. I bet you could walk into your gym, just look at the climbs, look at those holes, and you probably know exactly how you need to grab those holes to make them feel good. That's because you know that gym, you know all the footholds and the handholds, and you know how to climb that certain style. And then when you transition outside, things are gonna be very different. Um, And the reason we want to talk about it is what Mercedes said. The lesson that she learned is we want to just encourage people to bring an open mind and reset their expectations when climbing in a new area, whether or not that's outside or in a different gym. And I have another analogy for that. The idea being, let's say, if you, like us, live in the United States and then you go travel to another country, like I'm going to be going to France pretty soon. I don't go to France expecting I'm going to be eating the same breakfast every morning and that I'm going to be, following the same routines because it's a different country and the different country has a different framework, and climbing is very much like that. And it's just really important to bring an open mind when we go to these new places and explore the sport in a new way. So, if you're someone who loves climbing in different areas and who loves the idea of climbing outside, but you find it really hard, here's a few things to think about that we want to talk about as you transition to outdoor climbing. Things that might be different, some advantages and disadvantages, and how you could think about them. And again, our goal with that is to prepare you and also encourage you to be patient and again to bring that open mind to that transition. It's not you. There's nothing wrong with you. Like Mercedes, she moved to Seattle. I remember that because I met her. When I met her, she told me that climbing in Seattle, around Seattle, sucks because there's no feet. And she also didn't know how to climb on slab.
Yep.
And so she has
Yep.
learned a lot since then. And we're sharing this because Mercedes is a very strong and also very capable climber. But she's become this way because she's practiced and learned and also was willing to see where she could improve even when she was already quite good. Because that can be a bit of a trap. People who are quite good already, and that's what I see personally, people who climb hard stuff, let's say V8 in the gym, and they go outside and they can only climb V3 on their first day. That's a hard hit. And if you want to become a really good climber, you need to be able to want to look at the reasons for why something feels hard to you, really honestly, so you can become a better version of yourself.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think it's about being adaptable too. I think there's I don't know a lot of people who can climb the same grade in a lot of different areas. Those people exist. There's a couple people like, yeah, okay. Like that's to me, that's like actually very inspiring is just the ability to adapt to these new spaces, new areas. And I think there is a huge mental component to that. And outdoor, there is a lot more, I guess, choices that you can make in how you're going to position your body compared to the indoor setting. So outdoors, you do have to have a very open mind in terms of like sequences. There's things that you can use that maybe you never thought you could use. You have to look around a lot, especially when you're trying to unlock these movements. There's things that you could use, and you just have to identify those things. And that takes a really long time to learn.
Yes.
Like, oh, this
Yes.
is a thing that I can actually use. And so I think the climbers who are at the very top tier who can climb very hard in a lot of different areas have that unlocked. It's not that they're stronger. I think they're just mentally more flexible and adaptable,
Yeah.
and apply that.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's kind of like the big advantage, like the big upside and downside about outside climbing. So it's both at the same time. And I think that's one of the things that people who are new to climbing outside initially find harder. And then it actually becomes easier compared to the gym. So it's something that starts out being harder and then becomes easier. It's just the different opportunities for movement outside. Because in the gym, most of the routes nowadays, they are color coded. So you know exactly which holds you're allowed to use. So the options are already like a lot simpler than outside climbing. In outside climbing, there's so many more options to use your body on the rock to make it up the rock, even when you have beta from other people or when there's chalk on the holes. There's just so many more options to explore. And what Mercedes was saying, and people who get really good at exploring new options are now able to use it to their advantage because they're able to use beta in very different ways than other people do it. So it's also often more suitable to different types of climbing physiques, I guess, for people with, different body shapes, lengths of their arms and, legs. And exactly. So it can be better
Mhm.
suited for different types of people. Um, yeah, I think that's the biggest difference. So some people, like, we love seeing the opportunities for movement outside, but it can also be really hard. And that's our number one tip, is that when you go outside, really study the rock. Really look at the rock and look at all these different options. Do not just use the chalked holes. Do not just use the beta that other people have. You can literally, that's the beauty. When you're outside, you can use, for the most part, all the feet. I will say that's my pet peeve with bouldering. Sometimes when you go boulder, there's certain boulders where you're not allowed to touch a certain hole to make it a certain grade, but that's for a different podcast. But in general,
Mhm.
you can use whatever you want to make it up the rock. And that's really, really beautiful. And that's probably the biggest thing to learn that's different from inside climbing, because inside climbing can really like limit our minds to a certain type of movement that the root setters, force us to do. So yeah, for sure. That's
Mhm.
one big difference for outside climbing, which is why bringing some patience is really, really important.
Yeah.
Some other things are more practical things that I have on my list that I would love to cover, Mercedes, unless you have something you want to add to this.
Oh no, go ahead.
It's just some basic things that can make climbing outside initially much harder, which is the number one is skin. So that's an issue more so than climbing inside. I find depending on the rock type that you choose outside, your your skin care or your skin conditioning becomes a lot more of an issue compared to climbing inside. Most people climb inside, they don't usually like talk about skin. And if you've heard climbers, talk to each other, half of the climbers like to talk about their skin. It's a thing. I think it's hilarious about our sport. But when you climb outside, that's really a thing. So when you start climbing outside and you're new to climbing outside, you're gonna have to give your skin some time to adjust. So your skin might wear thin, you might tear holes, it might feel really uncomfortable. Just be aware that when you go outside for the first time, the first couple times, maybe even a few weeks, to not spend too much time on the rock. So you're not tearing up your skin, but you give your skin some time to build up those calluses. And people climb outside, their calluses tend to be bigger for the most part, or different at least, than for people who climb inside. So that skincare is a huge, huge issue and something to consider. And
Yeah, I
actually, for
think
me,
that
yeah.
yeah, I think there's a even a style difference. Like I think indoors we're so used to kind of slapping for things. Like like we go so powerful. Like the nature of indoor climbing can sometimes be a lot more powerful, which is great. Like indoor climbing is like more strength and power, but it teaches you to move a little less precisely. And so if you're applying that same movement to outdoors, there's a much higher chance of getting a flapper or shredding through your skin faster because one, there's texture. And so if you're slapping for things constantly, you're getting rid of that skin a lot faster. So outdoors, it's better if you can move a little slower so that you don't slap at these like very sharp holds, you know? So that would be one adaptation like I think you can do as you transition to outdoor climbing is like just slow down a little bit. And that will save your skin, especially on your first couple days.
Okay, the second thing I wanted to talk about is safety, which can be very different outside than inside. And I want to talk about it because it's also really important. Some people might not feel as safe when they climb outside compared to inside, and that is because outdoor climbing is inherently a lot less safe than indoor climbing. So if you feel less safe outdoor climbing than indoor climbing, I'm here to tell you you are very normal. That is very okay to feel less safe. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about how we can make it feel more safe, or maybe choices we can make. I mean, depending on the type of climbing that you do, we always encourage people to get educated on how to climb outside. Ideally, you want to find a mentor you can go with that can help you get yourself set up safely. This is true for bouldering, sport climbing, and also, well, especially trad climbing, which trad climbing you can't really do inside. It's really important to try to be as safe as possible. And now the safety measures are going to be different if whether or not you sport climbing and bouldering outside. I will just plug this right here. For sport climbing, I'm a big advocate for helmets. Most people don't wear helmets sport climbing outside. I have seen a lot of rock fall and gear fall and whatever fall, things that you don't want to get hit by. I've seen people hurt, people get hit by stuff. I think it's so easy to wear a helmet. Personally, I wear a helmet all the time. I'm often the only one at the crag unless I'm with other parents whose kids are around. But I encourage people that it's just so easy to do. And, there's rockfall even at sport crags. It doesn't just happen when climbing trad. That's my 2 cents. I just want to share. I'm all about safety. And the helmet does not distract, at least me, from having fun. Yeah. And then of course, when you go sport climbing outside, you want to make sure that the gear that you trust, that your gear in the rock is something that you can trust. And that is something to always think about when you go for the first time. Questions to ask people who you go with, looking at the gear, looking at the bolts. That is really important because we do put a lot of trust in the gear when we go climbing outside. And sometimes that also means, maybe considering better traveled crags or maybe not starting at crags that are less traveled, where maybe the gear has frosted. Um, was that the right word? Was that an English word?
Frosted,
Is that an English word?
like the gear froze.
That was a German word. Oh my goodness. I was like, that did not sound right. Well, let me, it's what's the English word for it? When it goes and when it turns, it's like an erosion, like it's metal and it gets wet and then it
Rusted.
rusts. It's
Yes.
rusted. That rust. Well, here we go. I'm teaching you some German at the same time.
Yeah.
Um, yes. So, I mean, I can't give specific, advice right now, but my biggest advice would be to go with people out there and definitely ask questions. Ask questions about the anchors that are out there. Um, go with people who are trusted. Because another thing too that happens to people go for the first time is, especially when people top rope, they have to trust someone to set up a top rope and an anchor that someone else built at some point, right? So I think it's just something to think about, and it's okay to ask questions, and it's okay to look at gear, and it's okay to decide not to do it if you don't want to. That's just what I wanted to say. Most crags, especially well-traveled crags, they have people who take care of them, consider donating money to those people because those people pay for all that stuff. So yeah, but safety is really important. Bouldering safety is different, but actually I will say sometimes I find bouldering safety harder than sport climbing safety because in sport climbing it's obvious that we need to be safe. But for bouldering, what I see more often is that people just show up with a pad and they throw a pad down because it's so easy and then they just get on the rock. And there is an art to padding a boulder safely. So that is something to be learned. Make sure that you figure out where you might be landing, bring enough pads, try to not have any edges. If you have blubbers or something that you can cover over cracks or edges in your padding so you're not rolling an ankle, that's a really good one. Having spotters, especially if you're new, I don't recommend going solo right away. Having spotters is really great. And here's one piece of advice, super important. Before you start climbing up a boulder, look at the down climb. You need to figure out how am I going to get down this boulder if I make it up. And that is especially true for people who are new to climbing outside because sometimes if you're projecting a V0 or V1, sometimes those climbs are also the down climbs. Or sometimes you have to jump down, or sometimes you have to, come down a tree. I love tree climbing and I can climb them really well. But I say this jokingly, but I have been with people who were quite uncomfortable climbing down a tree because it's just so different. And if you've not done it, it's going to be not super comfortable. So just be prepared for that because
Yeah,
that's a
down
huge difference.
climbing. Yes, down climbing, we don't do that very often. And I do appreciate sometimes SBP will make the down climb a little tricky. And I think some people will complain about that, but really they're trying to teach you how to down climb, because that I think is like definitely one of the places that I see a lot of beginners either freak out and it might change their mind about climbing outside, and that would be really unfortunate. Like it might be worth learning how to down climb in a gym, like learning how to reverse what you just did. I think that's a great skill.
Yeah. And again, also bringing that patience and just knowing, hey, it's a skill I'm going to have to learn. Just like topping out. is actually also so much harder. If you're fortunate to have a top-up boulder at your gym where you can practice mantling, that's great. But a lot of topping out boulders outside requires people to mantle, and that is a skill we don't learn at the gym. And that is always the number one skill that I have a hard time with when I go back outside is topping out because it's a skill I don't learn at the gym or don't practice at the gym very often. And it's also usually the highest point of the boulder. It's where I don't want to fall. So I'm like, so it always looks really funny. So the top outs are often grade wise easier moves than the lower moves, but I find topping out is pretty hard for a lot of people. So I'm by no means
Yes.
ashamed of it, even though
Yeah.
sometimes I do quite some beach whaling and use all my body to just make it on top of the boulder for sure.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, is there anything else you want to say? I think we covered a lot of things. We just, as I said, we wanted to encourage people to just be patient and just, kind of change their mind in terms of how they approach climbing outside.
Yeah. I think it's important to remember the skill sets, just like reiterating that like indoors is is really becoming its own sport and it is its own sport. And it is going to be more strength and power oriented. It by its nature, it's harder to create these manufactured footholds that mimic outdoor. Um, so, like it is a totally different thing. And to me, indoors really teaches you sequencing, how to try hard. You're gonna learn a lot about dynamic movement. And then outdoors is more about having that patience, developing really good skill sets with your feet, problem solving, um, safety, that mental aspect as well. So I don't know if you're able to do both. That's that's really, really great, and yeah, one is not necessarily better than the other. And it's whatever you really love to do in the end. Yeah.
Wonderful. That's a great
Yeah.
wrap up.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah. Thanks everybody. We'll catch you in the next one.
That's good. Bye.
Bye.